I'm a Professor of Child Development here at the University of Leicester. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been studying what happens to premature babies as they grow up. And over that time, I've become increasingly interested in how premature birth can affect children's development and learning, and importantly, what kinds of support they might need at school. So we are delighted here at the University of Leicester to be working in partnership with the Smallest Things charity to bring you this webinar today. So the aims of my next 20 minutes or so are to try and explain to you what we know from research about how premature birth can affect children's development and learning. And if your child does have difficulties, what kinds of support they might need in school. And hopefully you may leave feeling more prepared and empowered to approach your child's school about issues relating to prematurity, if that's something you might wish to do. So to do this, I'm going to present some key facts and figures about premature birth and summarise what we know from research about the impact of premature birth on children's cognitive development, their social and emotional development, and outcomes at school. Now, I've got the research bit, so I am going to be presenting some graphs and some figures for those who are interested in the numbers. If you're less so, don't worry, just listen to me and I will explain it all. So to start then, those key facts and figures. What is premature or preterm birth? Well, I'm sure we all know that a typical full-term pregnancy will last around 40 weeks of gestation. And most babies, the vast majority of babies in the UK, are born at term between 37 and 42 weeks of gestation. So around about 92% of babies are born at term. Preterm babies are those that are born before 37 weeks of gestation. And that equates to around 8% of all births in the UK, and that's about 50,000 babies per year. There's a smaller group of babies who are born very preterm, before 32 weeks of gestation. And within that group, there's an even smaller subgroup of babies who are born extremely preterm, before 28 weeks of gestation. And they're a much smaller number, so only about 1% of babies a year are born very or extremely preterm. But those are the children who I guess we are most concerned about in terms of their long-term outcomes. And this is because gestational age at which babies are born can not only have a different impact on their need for neonatal care after birth, but also on their long-term outcomes. And as I'm going to describe to you now, and for that reason, we often classify children into these groups when we're studying the effects of prematurity. So with that in mind, what do we know about the long-term consequences of preterm birth? Well, we know that on average, as a group, children who are born preterm are at higher risk for developmental problems and disorders later in life than children who are born at term. We also know that premature birth may affect multiple areas of a child's development. So even children without severe difficulties may have multiple mild difficulties in many areas of their development, which combined can still have quite a significant impact on their learning and their performance at school. Whilst most of our research is focused on very preterm born children, we do know from recent studies that effects of prematurity may be seen after birth at all preterm gestations. That means that even those babies born late or moderately preterm at 32 to 36 weeks of gestation may have some difficulties or be at slightly higher risk of difficulties than children who are born at term. But what is very clear from the research is that the risk of difficulties later in life is related to a baby's gestational age at birth. So put simply, this means the earlier a baby is born, the greater the risk for difficulties with their development later in life. And for that reason, it's babies born very, and particularly extremely preterm, who are at highest risk. We also know that where those developmental problems are present, often they may appear in infancy in the first few years of life, and they may persist through to adulthood. We also know, however, that only a very small proportion of children born preterm, even those born very or extremely preterm, have severe disabilities. So things such as blindness, deafness, or maybe physical disabilities such as cerebral palsy. But many more children may have cognitive problems or social emotional difficulties following their preterm birth, when those are much more common than physical difficulties. And this slide here shows the 6 areas of cognitive and social emotional development which we know that premature babies might be at risk for. And I'm going to describe each of these to you very briefly in turn. But before I start, just for those who are not familiar with the term cognitive development, this relates to a group of thinking skills that allow us to reason, to problem solve, to process information mentally, and to remember and learn. So these kind of skills are really important for how children do at school. So let's take a look at these 6 areas of potential difficulties that some preterm children might have. So first of all, we know that children born preterm are at higher risk for difficulties with working memory than children who are born at term. So working memory can be thought of like a mental notepad that we can use to hold information in mind for a short period of time whilst thinking about something else. So for example, holding in mind a long list of instructions whilst you're implementing each step. And we know that children who have working memory difficulties often struggle to process a long list of instructions, or might have particular difficulty carrying out tasks that have multiple steps. They also may struggle where there's lots of distractions in the environment and where they feel there's too much information for them to be able to hold in mind at one time. We also know that on average, children who are born preterm may have slower processing speed than term-born children. Processing speed is generally the time taken to complete mental tasks or process information mentally. And this means that children with slower processing speed might take longer to read or comprehend instructions or to complete tasks that they're working on. And so they might need a little bit of extra time to complete activities in the classroom. We also know that children who are born preterm may have difficulties with fine motor skills or with visuospatial processing or hand-eye coordination. And these kind of skills are really important for many different activities in the classroom, right through from getting changed for PE, participating in sports and navigating the classroom environment, through to writing, drawing, using scissors or copying from the whiteboard. We also know that a very small proportion of children born preterm may have developmental coordination disorder, and that's more frequent in preterm than term-born children. And that's a disorder that's associated with quite significant difficulties with movement. But that's still quite rare, and actually many more prematurely born children might have difficulties with eye-hand coordination or visuospatial processing that still impact on their learning and performance at school. We also know that children born preterm are more likely to have learning difficulties, and that of all the subjects studied at school, they're most likely to have difficulties with mathematics, and I will explain that shortly. We also know preterm children are at higher risk for difficulties with attention or concentration than children born at term. So they might have difficulty paying attention in the classroom, or they might appear as though they're quite disorganized, or they're forgetful or lose things easily. We also know that prematurely born children are at higher risk for ADHD than term-born children. So that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And interestingly, where preterm children do have ADHD, often they have more difficulties with attention and perhaps less so with hyperactivity or being impulsive. But the risk of ADHD is still quite low overall, and many more preterm children may have attention difficulties that aren't severe enough for a diagnosis, but which still impact on their learning at school. And finally, we know that children born preterm are at higher risk for social and emotional problems. In particular, they may be shy or anxious or withdrawn, nervous or clingy in new situations, and may feel sad, lonely, or depressed. We also know they're at higher risk for social difficulties, so they might have difficulties maintaining or making friendships, interacting with peers, or working in groups. They may prefer the company of adults over other children. And we do know that children in general with social difficulties may become isolated. And we do know that children born very preterm are at higher risk of being bullied than children born at term. And this may impact their mental health and well-being. We also know that the rates of autism are higher amongst preterm children, particularly those born extremely preterm, than term-born children. But just as with ADHD, the rates of autism is still quite rare, and only a small proportion will have a diagnosis. But many more children might have social or communication difficulties, which still impact on how they integrate and how they do at school. Interestingly, what we also know from many research studies is that prematurely born children tend not to be at increased risk of externalizing behavior problems. This means they're no more likely than term-born children to have what we might think of typically as behavior problems, to be disruptive or aggressive or antisocial. They tend not to be the children who disrupt the classroom or who are fighting in the playground. And this is really important because of this kind of pattern of difficulties and the fact that these children tend not to be more antisocial or disruptive in the classroom. And in fact, preterm children often can appear quite compliant and eager to please and unwilling to ask for help. This means that if the school isn't aware of prematurity and what that can mean for the child, that the premature children's difficulties may go undetected in school and they may not receive the support that they could need. Of course, I probably don't need to tell you that that might have significant implications for education and for schooling. And it will be no surprise that research also shows that on average, as a whole group, children born preterm, particularly those born very and extremely preterm, have poorer educational outcomes than children who are born at term. And this is shown really clearly in this graph taken from the PRISM training that you'll hear about later today. And this uses data from 19 local authority areas in Scotland. And this shows the proportion of children with special educational needs in relation to their gestational age at birth. So the bars here show the percentage of children with special educational needs. So the higher the bars, the greater the percentage of children. And along the x-axis at the bottom, this shows the week of gestation when children were born. So from the far right, at 40 weeks of gestation, which is full term, moving to the left, right down to 24 weeks of gestation. And I think the most interesting or important thing about this graph is the shape of those bars. So if you move from the right-hand side to the left, you see those bars gradually increase, especially when you get below 32, 31, 30 weeks of gestation. And this really shows how outcomes or long-term outcomes can be related to children's gestational age at birth. Now, I'm often asked how many children have special educational needs. Well, that can differ between studies, but in this study, this equates to around 1 in 20 children who were born at term gestations, around 1 in 12 children who were born late or moderately preterm, around 1 in 5 children born very preterm, and up to, in our own studies carried out here at Leicester, up to 2 in 3 children born extremely preterm before 26 weeks of gestation. So I think this clearly shows how gestational age can have an impact on children's development. It won't impact every child, and not every child will have difficulties and certainly won't have special educational needs. But on a group level, there is an association between the earlier a baby is born and educational outcomes. Of course, not all children will have special educational needs, but we do see a similar pattern of results if we look at academic attainment. And this graph now shows children's attainment in the early years foundation stage at the end of reception year at age 5. So we start with full term, again on the right-hand side, moving down to early term, late preterm, moderate preterm, and very preterm on the bar on the left-hand side. Now this time, the bars show the percentage of children who fail to get a good level of attainment in the early years. And again, you see that rise as you go from right to left, where the more preterm children are born, the less likely they are to have the good or the expected level of attainment in the early years. And this equates to around 51% of full-term children who failed to achieve that level, compared with 66% of those born very preterm. Now, this looks a bit busy, but it's actually the same graph, but this time showing you the results for all of the 6 different areas of learning in the early years. So personal, social, emotional development, communication and language, mathematics, knowledge and understanding of the world, physical development, and then creative development on the right-hand side. And I think all that I want to demonstrate from this is that we see the same pattern of results in every area of the curriculum in the early years foundation stage. So we see that impact, or the potential impact of prematurity right from starting school and right across all areas of the national curriculum. But as well, from other studies, we also know that of all the subjects studied at school, prematurely born children are most likely to have difficulties with mathematics. And we know from our studies here in Leicester and in the UK that actually mathematics difficulties for preterm children are most likely related to their cognitive difficulties that I described earlier, rather than to deficits with numerical skills. And they're particularly related to difficulties with working memory or with visuospatial skills, because mathematics can rely quite heavily on having good skills in these areas. So their mathematics difficulties are related to those areas of potential difficulty I previously described. And this means that intervention for children with other kinds of mathematical difficulties, such as dyscalculia, are unlikely to be effective for preterm children. And we think they may be better supported in the classroom by teachers supporting their working memory and their visuospatial skills when learning mathematics. Now, is this only a problem for the preschool and the primary school years? And indeed, over the last 20 or so years, I've heard quite a lot of professionals say, or tell me, it's okay, they'll catch up. By the time they get to secondary school, it will come out in the wash and these children will catch up with their peers. And I think that is absolutely true. We've got to remember that for some preterm children, they will have absolutely no difficulties at all, educationally, cognitively, or social emotionally. But for those that do, on average, we find in studies that those children born very preterm in particular and extremely preterm as a group tend not to catch up with their peers. So this graph is the same as before, but now it shows attainment in Key Stage 2 when children sit their SATs at the end of Year 6 at age 11. Here we see the same shape of the graph, but this time it's the moderate and the very preterm who are at higher risk for not having the expected level of attainment in English and mathematics in their Key Stage 2 SATs at the end of primary school. So this equates to around about 16% of full-term children who fail to get that level of achievement, up to 39% of those children born very preterm. So at the end of primary school, on average as a group, moderate and very preterm children are falling behind their term-born peers. And now this shows exactly the same graph, but for GCSEs. And this time the bars show the percentage of children not achieving 5 GCSEs, grades A to C, including in English and mathematics. And now you'll see it's really the very preterm children whose attainment on average is poorer than children born at term. And in fact, 44% of full-term children failed to achieve this level of GCSEs, compared with 60% of those born very preterm. So even though prematurity can affect children all gestations, and there are larger numbers of late and moderately preterm born children, we know from research that the earlier a baby is born, the greater the risk. So it's those children who are born very and extremely preterm who are at the greatest risk for these kinds of difficulties. But even among those groups, there are a large proportion who will have no lasting problems at all. So if we try and put all this together, we know that children born preterm, on average, are at higher risk for cognitive, social, emotional, attention difficulties and learning difficulties. And so if you were to go to the school and say, my child might need some support, what areas might they need support? These, going back to the 6 areas I described previously, are the kinds of difficulties children have and the areas that you can tell the teacher or your early years provider they may need some help. So attention problems, working memory difficulties, slow processing speed, poor hand-eye coordination, social emotional problems, and mathematics difficulties. So hopefully that's helped you understand a little bit about what kinds of difficulties you might be considering if you're a parent of a preterm child and what support is needed. I guess practically one of the most important things parents can do is attend neonatal follow-up appointments where they are offered. So here in the UK, routine developmental follow-up is usually offered everywhere for children who were born very preterm, before 30 weeks of gestation. And in 2017, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, that's NICE, recommended that children born less than 30 weeks of gestation should be followed up and have an assessment at 24 months of age to check their development. And that actually those born less than 28 weeks of gestation, extremely preterm, should ideally have another assessment at 4 years of age, which should be helpful for informing the school what kinds of support they might need. I think nationally that hasn't been as easy to implement, and that isn't happening in all areas yet. But certainly a lot of very preterm children will be offered an assessment at 2 years, and that should be taken up because that will help people identify early any difficulties. But we're still left with a problem in that most children won't have follow-up. So most preterm children are born late and moderately preterm, and they won't be offered neonatal follow-up unless they have other developmental problems or neonatal difficulties. And also, most of the children, very preterm children who are followed up, if they don't have severe disabilities, they may be discharged from neonatal care. And that is the last point of routine contact with healthcare that the parent and the child might have. And we know, and we frequently hear from parents actually, that problems seem to emerge over the preschool years before the child starts school. And this means that after 2 years, identifying difficulties and providing appropriate support is falling more and more to education services. It seems to be the job of the school to pick up where healthcare possibly left off for these children to figure out what support might be needed. And without any routine sharing of information between health and education services, this means that the school might not know about your child's prematurity. And therefore, as a practical step, if you feel it's appropriate, it may be helpful to discuss your child's birth history with the school. But importantly, we don't just want to tell them your child was born preterm. We want to tell them what this means, how it might affect children's development, and what they can do to support your child in school if they have difficulties. And there are resources that we have developed with my research team and also with the Smallest Things charity to help you do this. And you'll hear more about that later on this morning. But before I finish this first section, I've got just a couple of summary points and take-home messages that I'd really like to reiterate. So, in summary, the research tells us that on average, as a group, children born preterm, particularly those born very and extremely preterm, are at higher risk for cognitive, attention, social and emotional difficulties than children born at term. These may impact on their performance at learning and performance at school and their learning. And for that reason, we also know that as a group, on average, children born preterm are at higher risk for special educational needs and poorer academic attainment than term-born children, particularly in mathematics. This means that prematurely born children may need additional support in school. And we also know that that special constellation or pattern of difficulties I've described in those 6 areas means that preterm born children may not be the types of children who would disrupt the classroom. They tend not to have externalizing behaviour problems, and that means their difficulties may be overlooked in school because they might not come to the teacher's attention as having special educational needs in the same way that other children do, because they're not so disruptive. And that means we often hear parents talk about the fact they feel their child may have fallen under the radar. We know that education professionals have a really key role to play in identifying children's needs if they are there and providing support. So it's really important that schools are aware of prematurity and know how to support your child if they need it. And 2 final points, really important. The first is that every child is different. As a professional, as a parent, we all know this, and therefore an individual approach to support is ultimately needed. We know if a child is born preterm, we could look at those 6 areas of difficulty I have described, and that might help as a starting point. But ultimately, every child is different, premature or not, and we need to take an individual look at their strengths and their needs to provide appropriate support. And finally, Prematurity is a risk factor. It is not a diagnosis. Premature birth places children at higher risk for long-term difficulties. It does not mean they will have them. Some children born just a couple of weeks early may have quite significant difficulties in school, but some children, and we know from our research indeed, born at 23 or 24 weeks of gestation have absolutely no difficulties at all. So it doesn't mean your child will have difficulties, it is a risk factor. But ultimately, preterm born children, they may be in neonatal care for 12 weeks, for 12 months, but they are 12 years in education. And so with the right support in schools and in early years providers, we have a real window of opportunity to try and improve outcomes for these children.